Brian Douglas Wilson was born June 20th, 1942. Both his parents drank heavily, though his father gave him the most problems. Murray Wilson ran the home with an iron fist. Murray hated himself, resented the world, and took it all out on his family. Physical beatings were common, and this, along with psychological torturing, scarred his children for life. Not that Murray was aware of any of this. He felt he was a firm but fair father. Murray's father himself was a heavy drinker and physically abusive. He died alone, despised by his family. The only affection offered in the Wilson household came in the form of food. Brian loved to eat, as did his brother Carl. Dennis not so much. Brian's parents had very little in common other than drinking and music, the latter being the reason they got together. Murray had taught himself how to play piano in his early years and was an aspiring songwriter. So frightened by the time Brian started elementary school, he was convinced the other children would beat him. He walked around with his hands in a guard, expecting an attack at any moment. It never came. Brian was also deaf in one ear. Whether this was a result of Murray's beatings is up for speculation, but either way, he was deaf in one ear and grew up asking everyone to repeat themselves. This annoyed his father and others around him. He quickly learned to let things pass. As far back as Brian can remember, he could always hear music, faint melodies in his head. The Wilsons lived in a house in Hawthorne, California. Murray had purchased the house after Dennis Wilson was born. They owned a car, and Murray worked tirelessly at Goodyear. Murray aspired to be a songwriter and sat at the piano each night writing tunes. Watching his father writing songs, Brian believed he could write them too. So at age 5, he picked up the ukulele and began to strum a few chords. Murray had converted the garage into a music room, and he and Audrey played duets. Murray would play piano and Audrey would play organ. Brian and Dennis began following their parents into the music room where Brian would sing along. In his father's eyes, it was the only thing he did right. When Brian was 10 years old, Murray's song Two Step Sidestep was released by a group called The Bachelors. It featured on their album, but Murray believed it had more potential. So convinced of the song, Murray even invented a little dance to go with it. Dennis, as it happened, thought the song was terrible. When the song was played on the radio, Murray was over the moon, the happiest Brian had ever seen him. That week, there was no screaming or yelling in the Wilson household. By this point, Murray had left Goodyear and started a business called Able Machinery, selling equipment to airplane companies. In the night of the radio broadcast, Murray was so excited he couldn't sit down. He paced the room, smoking one cigarette after another. "Why don't you quit pacing and practice your dance?" Dennis said. Murray snapped, "Quiet," and continued pacing. All of a sudden, Carl, the youngest member of the family, shouted, "Hey, that's Dad's song!" And Two Step Sidestep was on the radio. Murray was struck by emotion. He burst into tears. Murray's songs gave the impression he was a gentle, peaceful soul, but that side of him only ever came out in his music. One day, Murray called the entire family into the kitchen, and when they entered, he was stood on the kitchen table completely naked, pounding his chest like Tarzan. He screamed, "I'm the king of the family. Is that clear?" To which the boys nodded yes before leaving the room. The three brothers dealt with family life in different ways. Dennis spent as much time out the house as possible, and Carl hid under his bed. One time, Murray forced Brian to defecate in a newspaper. Brian sobbed after, unable to look at the newspaper. It scarred him for the rest of his life. Murray had lost an eye at the age of 25 and delighted on frightening his children by taking it out. One day after frightening Brian, Audrey walked into the room to see him chuckling. Murray kept his glass eye in a glass next to the bed. Brian always rinsed every glass thoroughly before using it. To this day, he prefers to drink out of a bottle. Though terrified of his father, Brian desperately wanted his approval, and he knew the key to his father's praise would be through music. Brian began teaching himself how to play piano by watching Murray play chords. When Murray heard his efforts, he remarked, "Not bad for a kid." The music room from then on became Brian's sanctuary, the only refuge from Murray's rage. While the music played, there was harmony in Brian's world. It offered him everything he wanted. When Brian first heard the Four Freshmen, he begged his mother Audrey to buy him their record. She couldn't resist, and Brian sat listening to the four-part harmonies in awe. He soon bought every record they had and listened obsessively. By the age of 16, Brian had begun teaching Carl and Dennis how to sing in harmony. By that point, Brian had received a tape recorder for his birthday, and he began laying down tracks, overdubbing voices and adding guitars. Brian both envied and felt intimidated by his cousin Mike Love. Mike exuded confidence. Every Christmas, the Wilsons and Loves got together for a feast. After the feasts, they would often sing carols, Mike making sure his voice was heard above anyone else's. Al Jardine was a school friend of Brian's, and after he accidentally broke his leg on the football field, Brian felt forever indebted to him. With Carl playing guitar and Mike and Al singing, Brian had a group he could rehearse songs with. On the insistence of his mother Audrey, Dennis was soon added to the lineup. To begin with, they played covers, but Mike insisted they write their own music. He told Brian, "We could write songs as good as the stuff on the radio." Mike's confidence gave Brian confidence. Mike came up with the name the Pendletones after the shirt. Al came up with the idea of covering Sloop John B, but nothing would come of that until many years later. When the group was struggling to come up with a niche, Dennis suggested they write a surf song, Dennis being a keen surfer himself. While Murray and Audrey were on vacation in Mexico City, the group hired some equipment and began rehearsing surfing. When Murray arrived back and spotted the equipment, he went insane, throwing Brian against the wall. It was only after he cooled down and listened to the song, he began thinking. "I don't know," he said. "It's not professional, but it's not bad." Murray quickly put himself in managerial position of the band. He said, "If there's any talk of contracts, let me do the talking." After a session for surfing, a young promotion man named Russ Regan changed the group's name to the Beach Boys. When Murray found out, he yelled down the phone to have the name changed back, but it was no use. Printing had already begun. Murray tried as much as he could to convince the group to record his songs. When Brian refused, he shouted, "My songs are better than yours, you should record them." Eventually Murray gave up, and the Beach Boys continued recording Brian's songs. After Surfing had sold 50,000 copies, the group received their first royalty check. It disappointed them all. They received $1,000, and in anger Brian snapped, "That's all the money we got?" Murray promised, "I'll draw blood before I let 'em get away with this crap." Murray began looking for a new record deal. In the meantime, a songwriter named Gary Usher knocked the door of the Wilson house. He'd heard the group on the radio and was interested in writing with Brian. That day, the pair wrote The Lonely Sea. By the time they'd finished, they'd become the closest of friends. Averaging a song a day, the pair wrote 409 and In My Room. The latter impressed Murray so much he stated, "Not bad, Usher, not bad." It was the nicest compliment he'd ever received from Murray. In 1962, Murray got the band signed to Capitol Records, and they wasted no time releasing 409. The single tanked, and Capitol quickly changed plans and pushed Surfin' Safari. Surfin' Safari did a lot better, and the band were rushed into the studio to record an album. Brian was consulted on every decision, and had he known what a producer's credit was, he would have asked for one. At this time, Al Jardine had left the group to pursue his career as a dentist and was replaced by Dave Marks. Dave lived just across the street from the Wilsons. Tension grew between Gary Usher and Murray. Murray never much cared for Usher. One time Usher had sat in a writing session between Murray and Brian and called his music old-fashioned. Murray threw him out the house soon afterwards. Usher was shocked at the way Murray spoke to Brian and once said, "You ought to belt him." One day Brian was working out a song on the piano and he could hear Murray criticising him from his bed. Brian ignored him and carried on playing. A few minutes later, Murray was in the doorway calling him lazy. Brian lost his mind and kicked the piano bench against the door, then screamed, "F you, Murray." Murray went back to bed and instructed Audrey to hit Brian with a board. She never did. One day, Usher and Murray had a shouting match outside Capitol Records. Murray wasn't paying Usher a penny of the royalties. One night, Brian and Usher sat drinking beer, imagining themselves as legendary world-renowned songwriters. Murray came in and berated Usher for giving Brian beer. After that, Brian decided it was time to move out. Brian packed his things and moved into a 2-bedroom apartment just 15 minutes away. As he pulled out of the driveway, Murray stood on the doorstep waving and crying. The sight of his son leaving home was too much for him to handle. It was around this time Brian first heard Phil Spector. Brian was immediately envious. One day at a recording session, Murray shoved Usher and ordered him out the studio. Usher soon left, and this was the beginning of the end for the songwriting partnership between Brian and Usher. Around this time, Brian met his future wife Marilyn Ravel. She was part of a female surf group, and on first meeting, Brian spilled hot chocolate on her leg. Marilyn was with her sister Diane, and at first, Brian couldn't decide which one he preferred. In fact, Diane actually liked Dennis and Marilyn preferred Carl. When Surfing USA became a hit, Chuck Berry immediately called Ripoff. Murray gave Chuck the copyright without even talking to Brian. Murray devised a system of fines to keep the band in line. $50 for hanging out with girls, $100 for cussing, $100 for not setting up equipment fast enough. After repeatedly being fined, Dave Marks quit the group and Al Jardine rejoined. Murray at this time was pursuing Brian non-stop to write new material. The anxiety before going on stage caused Brian to drink before performances. One time, he drank a whole bottle of wine. One night as they were driving to a gig, Murray began berating the group and hitting Brian. Mike was driving and he pulled over to have a fist fight by the side of the road. He landed a good punch and Murray fell down. The group drove the rest of the way in silence. Brian spent a lot of 1963 with his then girlfriend Marilyn Ravel at her home. The family's willingness to feed him at any time made their home very appealing. It became the Beach Boys' unofficial clubhouse. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Mike and Brian wrote a song in tribute to him. It was called The Warmth of the Sun. While Brian imagined the impact it would have, Mike imagined the money it would bring in. Around this time, Brian began to hear voices in his head at night. It sounded like screams, and the only way he kept them at bay was to carry on working. In 1964, the impact of the Beatles felt like a tidal wave that would drown the Beach Boys. Carl had pictures of the Fab Four in his bedroom. This revelation caused Brian to brand him a traitor. Brian feared the group was suddenly outdated. The Beatles pushed Brian to work harder in the studio. He was looking to progress their songs. He even thought about scrapping Shutdown Volume 2 and starting again. "The songs are fine, Brian," Mike said. "You're throwing away money in the bank." When Fun 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 was released, it hit number 5. The reason being, the Beatles held the 1 to 4 position on the charts. Brian was depressed. He concentrated all his energy into one track that would outdo the Beatles. I Get Around did just that. It reached number 1, overshadowing the group. In the meantime, Murray had become insufferable. He had attempted to cancel the sessions for Fun because he didn't like the song. He didn't think much of Wendy or I Get Around either. Things came to a head during the recording session for I Get Around. Murray sat in the control room with a scowl on his face. The group had already decided they couldn't carry on with him, and Mike had wrote him a letter firing him from the band. He ignored the letter and carried on turning up to sessions as if nothing had happened. During the I Get Around sessions, Murray was more intense than usual. He kept jabbing Brian in the chest, saying, "Those guitars aren't loud enough, they don't have any drive." When Brian responded, "But I like it this way," Murray shoved him, snapping, "Remember who you're talking to. I made this goddamn group. You'd be nothing without me." Brian responded by calling him a jealous old man. Murray then laughed sarcastically. "Jealous of what? My son, the loser?" At that point, Brian lost his mind and grabbed Murray. He thought about throwing a punch and envisioned laying him out, but instead he shoved him. The force sent Murray back a few steps, and Brian began screaming, "You're fired!" Murray left the studio. He drove home and fell into a depression, taking to his bed. He stayed there for more than a month. Not long after, Murray and Audrey separated. Brian was now 22 years old. He was over-emotional, he cried easily, laughed too loud, and acted on impulse. He feared Murray's words were true when he told him, "You'll never be a man." At this time, Brian met with Phil Spector, who was staying at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. Brian had wrote the song "Don't Hurt My Little Sister" for him. When the pair met, Brian asked Spector what he thought of I Get Around. He responded, "I think it's dumb enough to do pretty good." The pair then sat at the piano while Brian played "Don't Hurt My Little Sister." Spector suggested a few chord changes, and after 15 minutes, he got up and said, "That's enough. I'll get an arrangement for it, and I'll see you in the studio." Spector then disappeared into his bedroom without a goodbye. Brian left confused. Several days later, Brian saw him at Gold Star. Spector was obsessing over every little thing in the song. Nothing was right, and to make matters worse, his psychiatrist rang the studio. Spector answered, and a conversation began in which he was yelling and gesturing to the wall. After 10 minutes, he slammed the phone down and disappeared. One of Spector's team said the session was over and "Don't Hurt My Little Sister" wasn't used. Instead, the song appeared on Brian's next album. Spector would later finish the song, but he renamed it to "Things Are Changing for the Better." Around 1965, Brian was pushing the Beach Boys to their limits. In a session, he berated them all for not working as hard as him and stormed out of the studio. Murray phoned Brian nightly, trying to convince him to give him sole ownership of the Beach Boys songs. Brian eventually buckled under the pressure and agreed. Brian's drinking at this time was at an all-time high. He'd always liked a few beers, but only now was he drinking to excess. He began acting out more and more. Those close to him put it down to Brian being Brian. Living alone made Brian more depressed. He felt lonely and begged Marilyn to stay with him as much as possible. He would contact her to come over at night if he was having a panic attack, and waited by the window until he heard her Honda motorcycle pull up. Not long after, Brian told Marilyn he wanted to marry her, and when Murray heard his intentions, he said Brian was too immature to get married. Nevertheless, the arrangements were made, and the group were wed at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. By 1965, Brian had begun smoking marijuana. Marilyn freaked out when he told her. She knew nothing about drugs and feared the worst. During a plane ride, Brian suffered a panic attack. He began sobbing uncontrollably. First he wanted to get off the plane, but when they landed, he refused. He was taken to a nearby hospital where the doctor gave him a tranquilizer and sent him on his way. Brian took a flight back home the next day, and his mother Audrey was waiting for him at the airport. He craved mothering. Brian insisted they drive to the old home in Hawthorne where he, Dennis and Carl grew up. Nobody lived there now. It had stayed vacant since Audrey and Murray's separation. Brian walked around the empty house and a flood of memories came back. He felt strangely comforted standing there. Brian sat on the floor and told his mother about everything: smoking pot, the pressure of touring, Spector, Murray. When Brian returned home, Marilyn scheduled an appointment with a psychiatrist. Brian went to the sessions and explained the event on the plane. The psychiatrist put it down to exhaustion. Brian continued to smoke marijuana and the pressure from the record company mounted. He wrote "Please Let Me Wonder" whilst high, the first time he'd ever done that. At this point, Brian decided to quit touring. He arranged a meeting with the Beach Boys to tell them the bad news. Nervous beforehand, Brian went to dinner alone and gorged on junk food. The group had no idea why they were being asked to a meeting, possibly to record some new material. Brian dropped the revelation on them, telling them, "Don't worry, I see a beautiful future for the Beach Boys, but the only way we can achieve it is if we do our separate jobs. You guys will tour, I will stay in the studio and make music." Mike got teary-eyed and Dennis stormed out of the studio. Glenn Campbell was hired as Brian's replacement, and the Beach Boys set out for their first tour without Brian. Meanwhile, the Beach Boys' Today charted. Brian had written and arranged the second side of the album whilst high. While the group were away, Brian smoked pot every day. At her wit's end, Marilyn informed Carl of Brian's ever-growing drug use. When Carl told Murray, he rounded up Mike and Al and drove to Brian's apartment. They searched for drugs and after turning the place upside down discovered half an ounce of pot in a shoebox. When Brian arrived home, they quizzed him. Marilyn started crying and Murray threatened to call the cops. Not long after, Brian began talking about using LSD. Marilyn warned him, "I've heard people ruin their minds on LSD. Don't do it." Brian took no notice. A few weeks later, he took the drug at his friend Lauren's apartment. Marilyn and Murray hated Lauren. They saw him as a drug dealer, nothing more. At Lauren's apartment with lava lamps, music and water to drink, Brian took LSD for the first time. When the drug kicked in, Brian stood up and didn't move for almost an hour. He stayed motionless, staring at the lava lamps. Brian sat down at the keyboard, but the white keys all merged together to form one note. He tried to play anyway, but only one finger had the ability to work. This frightened Brian and he yelled, "Oh my God, I can't play the piano. I've got to get out of here." Brian fled the apartment and began walking up the street. He saw a house with a "for sale" sign and declared, "I have to buy this unbelievable house." Lauren convinced him otherwise and they continued walking. The next day he awoke on Lauren's couch. He felt exhausted, shaky and frightened. He returned home to Marilyn, who was furious. She sobbed, "What's happening to you, Brian? I feel as if I don't know you." The next day he sat at his piano smoking pot and wrote "California Girls." In the meantime, Bruce Johnston replaced Glenn Matlock as keyboardist. Murray Wilson at this time was managing a group called the Sunrays. He co-wrote and produced all of their songs. Car Party and Out of Gas were their first singles released. Murray insisted the Sunrays be the Beach Boys' opening act, but when Brian refused, Murray went off in a huff. He didn't speak to him until the Sunrays' third single, "I Live for the Sun," charted. Murray was over the moon and began gloating. Brian congratulated him, but also added the songs were rip-offs of the Beach Boys music. Murray was convinced the sun rays would blow the Beach Boys out of the water. They didn't, and after several more singles, the group faded to obscurity. In December 1965, the Beatles' latest album, Rubber Soul, was released. Brian sat at home listening to the album amongst a cloud of marijuana smoke. The record blew Brian away. He stated, "They put only great stuff on the album. That's what I want to do." Marilyn by this point had loosened her views on pot smoking. Times had changed, it was socially acceptable, and she too began indulging with Brian. Brian soon after began work on his next album, Pet Sounds. He intended it to be a masterpiece, each song flowing, one continuous thought. Brian stated, "The album has to be better than anything else. I want people to hear it and say, 'Wow, that can't be the Beach Boys.'" Brian wrote the songs with Tony Asher. Each morning he arrived at Brian's house unsure whether he'd even get out of bed. His actions at this time were becoming unpredictable. His mood flipped constantly. One minute Brian would be fine, then laughing, then next he'd be crying. His relationship was steady, but he'd begun to fall in love with his wife's sister Diane. Asher was taken back by how open Brian was about this. Brian often spoke of his worries he married the wrong woman. Capitol at this time were putting pressure on Brian to release a single. He chose the album's closing track, Caroline No. Brian played the song for his father Murray. Murray liked the song but suggested changing the key from C to D. Brian took his advice and the song was changed. Around this time, Brian attended a recording session with the Rolling Stones. They were recording tracks for their latest album, Between the Buttons. When Brian arrived, there was a large group of people and what seemed to be a party going on. Food, drugs and alcohol filled large tables. Brian thought to himself, "I could never work in such a crazy atmosphere." To him, the recording studio was like a church. Brian was introduced to Keith Richards and Mick Jagger. He was taken back by how nice they were. Nothing like the reputation they had at the time. Mick offered Brian a drink, but he refused, saying, "No thanks, I've heard you throw acid in people's cokes." Mick then laughed and pulled out a pre-rolled marijuana joint, and Brian accepted his gift. Mick turned and rounded up the band to record. The other members of the Stones returned to their instruments, but not before finishing their drinks. It took about half an hour. Brian settled onto the sofa, smoking the marijuana joint Mick had given him. It was potent stuff, and Brian felt disorientated and confused. The Stones began recording the song My Obsession. Very high at this point, Brian thought it was the best song he'd ever heard. By the time he got home, Brian was convinced the Stones had outdone him. He cancelled the sessions for Pet Sounds and stayed in bed smoking pot for 2 days straight. Eventually he pulled himself out of bed and continued work. Around this time he began writing the song Good Vibrations, but this would be put aside for later. He continued work with Tony Asher on the song God Only Knows. Brian hated the opening line, "I may not always love you." The next problem Brian had with the song was using the word God in a title. He feared it wouldn't receive radio airplay. Brian changed his mind though when Asher argued they'd be breaking new ground. For the album Pet Sounds, an orchestra was used with no track for each individual instrument. The whole orchestra was recorded live. The record was recorded without any of the Beach Boys playing their instruments. The only instrument they used was their vocals. The group didn't much like Brian's new songs, and their instinct was to go against the album. All except Dennis, who loved everything Brian did. Of the group, Mike especially opposed Pet Sounds. He refused to sing Hang On To Your Ego until the lyrics were changed to I Know There's an Answer. Caroline No was released and was a big disappointment. It only hit number 23 on the charts. Capitol rushed out Sloop John B, which fared better, reaching number 3. Brian brought home a finished copy of Pet Sounds, and he and Marilyn listened amongst a cloud of pot smoke. Brian had included the sounds of barking dogs and a train leaving the station after the last track ended. The couple sat smoking marijuana as the songs played. When the album finished, Brian stated, "Can you see me on the back of that train?" Marilyn replied, "I can, just going away." When Capitol heard the album, they were not impressed. They even considered shelving it. The album peaked at number 10. Capitol considered this a failure and released a compilation album titled Best of the Beach Boys 2 months later. Critically, the album was praised by everyone, even Lennon and McCartney. Good Vibrations, though mostly written 5 months previous, was chosen to be Brian's next release. When Glenn Campbell heard the song, he stated, "What were you smoking when you wrote that?" Brian's next writing partner would be Van Dyke Parks, a free-thinking songwriter, singer and piano player. The first time he travelled to Brian's house, he was pulled over by the police. He had no license for his motorbike and persuaded the cop to drop the charges if he got him a Beach Boys autograph. After Brian learned of Van Dyke's money problems, he bought him a Volvo, stating, "They are the safest car on the road." The first song the pair wrote was Heroes and Villains, though the song was put aside while Brian focused on making Good Vibrations. When the group heard the early version, Carl thought it was bizarre, Al didn't like it, and Mike called it avant-garde crap. Bruce Johnston, who'd been touring with the group as Brian's replacement, declared, "We're either going to have the biggest hit or the Beach Boys' career is over." He was right about the former. During this time, Brian became obsessed with the idea of healthy living. Idea being the key word. He suggested Marilyn grow vegetables in the backyard and sell them through the kitchen window. She refused. He then installed a sauna, reading about the positive effects of sweating. Brian was convinced the house was bugged, so he was only comfortable talking to people while in his swimming pool. The whole time, Brian and Van Dyke Parks were writing songs for their next album. The songs included Wonderful, Cabin Essence, Do You Dig Worms, and Holidays. Good Vibrations was released and hit number 1. All of a sudden, all of Brian's madness seemed to make perfect sense. Brian at this point was hailed as a genius and America's Lennon and McCartney. When a reporter asked him to describe himself in one word, he answered, psychedelic. Brian's mental state was becoming more unhinged by the day. The first day of recording sessions for the song Fire, he refused to enter the studio, putting it down to bad vibes. He declared the musicians, who'd been waiting 2 hours, be sent home. Van Dyke was infuriated. He didn't turn up to any more Fire sessions. That was the beginning of Brian acting on total instinct, no matter how crazy. Brian rebooked the session and appeared in the studio wearing a red fireman's hat. Pretty soon, he had all the crew wearing the same thing. The song was basically one long disturbing whine that Brian heard for years during his auditory hallucinations. When Brian learned of buildings burning down nearby, he believed the song was responsible. It was decided the song was too dangerous to go out into the world. Brian felt he dabbled into some kind of musical witchcraft. Smile, as the album was now titled, was scheduled for release at Christmas. Brian at this time went to see the Rock Hudson movie Seconds. He left believing Phil Spector had convinced Columbia Pictures to let him make the film just to screw with Brian's head. Brian felt frustrated when those around him thought that notion was insane. When the Beach Boys heard Brian's new songs, they didn't like a single one. The Christmas release date was expanded when Brian informed Capitol he needed more time. Brian at this point got it into his head he needed a giant sandbox in his house in order to help him create. His piano was placed in the sand and Brian began to play. When Van Dyke visited, he thought the idea was insane. He refused to go into the sandbox but would pull up a chair beside it. Van Dyke was becoming more and more frustrated by the day. He told Brian they needed to be alone to write songs without all of his friends around. Brian's friends, Van Dyke argued, were just hangers-on using him for his fame and wealth. Nevertheless, the two continued writing. Their greatest collaboration, Surf's Up, was written soon after. The Beach Boys opposed Brian's new music, and he begged Van Dyke to accompany him to the Cabin Essence sessions. Brian needed an ally of his own. The last time Van Dyke had been in a studio was with Brian during the Fire sessions. After that, he'd vowed never to return again, but gave in when Brian pleaded. Van Dyke arrived to a hostile reception from the Beach Boys. He was in their eyes part of the problem. Mike began questioning him on some of the lyrics he'd written. The lyrics read, "Over and over, the crow cries uncover the cornfield." Mike questioned what the lyrics meant, to which Van Dyke replied, "I don't know."
He says, "I haven't a clue."
Hey, they don't mean a damn thing, but they create an image that I find appealing.
Beaten, Van Dyke and Brian left the studio. On their journey back home, Van Dyke told Brian he feared they'd committed suicide and the only thing left was to drag out the carcass. Smile, Van Dyke felt, was a battle that had been lost. With that, their partnership ended. Brian carried on though. Sessions for the song Vegetables began. On that day, Paul McCartney stopped by the studio. He was at the time in LA visiting his girlfriend Jane Asher. When Paul arrived, he noticed the studio was packed full of different vegetables. He was amused by the song and watched Brian produce. The session ended around 2 a.m. and McCartney played Brian a song he'd written a few days previous. It was called She's Leaving Home, and with that, Paul left the studio. Not long after, Brian quit going to the studio and Capitol cancelled the release of Smile. Brian sank into a deep depression and stayed in his room. Downstairs he heard workmen Marilyn had hired dismantling the sandbox. Their house was soon afterwards put up for sale. The couple moved into a 14-room mansion in Bel Air. A recording studio was built directly below Brian's bedroom. The idea being he would always be able to record and he wouldn't even have to change out of his pajamas. By August 1967, Smile had been abandoned. It had cost the group a lot of money. The Beach Boys, not including Brian of course, went on the road to make up for the loss. Brian at this time had started carrying around an oxygen tank in case he quickly needed some fresh air. A year previous, the Beach Boys had started a record label called Brother Records. Brian tried to sign Danny Hutton's band Three Dog Night, but Mike didn't like them. According to Brian, when it came to a vote, Mike intimidated Carl and Al into siding with him. Three Dog Night signed with another label, and their first album blew up. They became one of the biggest groups in America. might cost the band millions of dollars in royalties they'd still be collecting to this day. The album Smiley Smile was released instead of Smile. A lo-fi production that peaked at 41 in the charts, it was a big disappointment. Carl described it as a bunt instead of a grand slam. The rest of the band felt the same. Still, the band pushed ahead and began working on their next album. They spent as much time encouraging Brian into the studio than they did recording songs. At this time, Murray Wilson released his first album. It was titled The Many Moods of Murray Wilson. The album featured covers of Beach Boys songs, Murray's own compositions, and even one from his plumber titled The Plumber's Song. Murray visited London to promote the album, and while there he gave an interview saying, "My son hasn't written a good song since Good Vibrations." In the interview, Murray predicted he'd never write anything good again. In December that year, Wild Honey was released. The title came from the honey jar Brian kept in his kitchen. The picture on the cover was of some stained glass window in Brian's house. It was the second in the lo-fi album trilogy and marked the end of any rivalry between the Beach Boys and the Beatles. The Beach Boys had now taken over from Brian with Carl as producer. By this point, Marilyn, Dennis and Carl had all begun smoking marijuana. This time, Dennis met the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the man who created transcendental meditation. Dennis soon introduced the rest of the Beach Boys. He phoned Brian and told him about the positive effects of meditation. He stated, "It's unbelievable, like drugs but better." Brian later met the Maharishi in New York. Brian sat down in a room that was filled with flowers, and the Maharishi asked, "So you're Brian, the big brother?" The Maharishi then asked him what path he wanted to wander, and Brian replied, "The path to the nearest burger stand." The room filled with laughter, and the Maharishi replied, "Food for thought." Brian afterwards began meditating, but it never worked for him. Of all the Beach Boys, Mike took to meditation the most. One thing Mike loved was when the Maharishi said wealthy individuals like him didn't have to give up their Rolls Royce and forsake their material pleasures to develop inner spiritual qualities. Mike visited Rishikesh while the Beatles were there and came back with the idea the Beach Boys should make a film about the Maharishi. It was put to a vote. Everyone voted against it, and Mike stormed out of the room. After this, the Beach Boys began work on their next album, Friends. Brian added only 2 new songs to the album. One of the titles summed up his life during this period. It was called Busy Doing Nothing. Brian was surprised when Dennis wrote 2 songs for the album. This was the beginning of many contributions by Dennis. After the album was complete, Marilyn gave birth to Brian's first child, a daughter named Carney. At this time, Mike convinced the group to go on tour with the Maharishi. The event would feature a set by the Beach Boys, followed by a lecture from the Maharishi. Ticket sales were low and audiences hostile, so the tour was cancelled. By 1968, Brian was introduced to cocaine and became a regular user. The Beach Boys were at this point desperate for a hit. Their last album, Friends, had been their worst selling album to date. On Mike's suggestion, he and Brian wrote a surf song. Just 2 weeks after the album was released, Do It Again charted. It fared well in the US charts and hit number 1 in the UK. During this time, Brian's cocaine use increased. While Brian snorted cocaine through the days and nights, the Beach Boys worked on their next album, 2020. Brian stayed mostly in his bedroom with Three Dog Night's friend Danny Hutton. If Brian heard anything he liked the sound of, he'd rush downstairs and give the group suggestions. When no one was around, Brian went into the studio and recorded songs. He was never satisfied with the recordings, and they never saw the light of day. Brian contributed only one new song to 2020. It was titled I Went to Sleep. The other songs featuring Brian were taken from the Abandoned Smile. For the album, Al Jardine covered a Lead Belly song titled Cotton Fields, the Cotton Song. Later, Jardine was dissatisfied with Brian's production and had it reproduced. It was retitled to just Cotton Fields and released as a single. Dennis brought the strongest contributions to the album apart from the older Smile songs. He'd done the same thing with Friends. One of his songs was titled Never Learn Not to Love. Its original title had been Cease to Exist and was written by the now infamous cult leader Charles Manson. He and Dennis were friends at this time, and he spoke at length about him to Brian. Brian never took to Manson. When Dennis brought him and a few of his women to the house, Brian locked himself in his bedroom. Marilyn didn't like them. They were dirty and showed no respect for the property. After they left, Marilyn had the toilet seats disinfected. Brian never allowed them to come back. At this time, the royalties from the Beach Boys songs began to dwindle due to a lawsuit with Capitol Records. Capitol's response to being sued was to stop releasing Beach Boys records, therefore cutting off all royalties. This affected Murray as he was taking a percentage. He called Brian and suggested or insisted they write a song. Murray visited the house and the two began writing. Murray stood wearing a suit and tie, and Brian sat at the piano with no shoes, wearing a dressing gown. The end result was Breakaway, one of their most underrated songs. Unfortunately, it was one of their biggest flops too. In 1969, by chance, Brian was in RCA Studios at the same time Elvis was there recording a soundtrack for his latest film. Brian got word he was interested in meeting. A few of his bodyguards checked the room before Elvis entered. He approached Brian, held out his hand and stated, "I've heard a lot about you. How you doing, Duke?" Brian figured he was joking around calling him Duke, so he decided to joke back with Elvis. He threw a karate chop and a kick towards Elvis, who didn't react at all. Elvis then said, "Hey man, don't do that." Brian replied, "Just kidding. Nice to meet you. How you doing?" Elvis responded, "Okay, I guess, but I'm a little concerned about you, Duke." Then Elvis talked for a few minutes about music until Brian decided to jokingly throw another karate chop at Elvis. Elvis was not impressed, got up out of his chair and snapped, "I told you not to do that," before walking out of the room. Around this time, Marilyn gave birth to Brian's second child, another daughter named Wendy. Brian worried he couldn't be much of a father to them, as he was having enough trouble taking care of himself. At this time in 1969, Brian had stopped writing songs altogether. He felt too depressed. To make things worse, Murray was in negotiations to sell Brian's songs. Brian had signed ownership over to him years previous. When Brian found out about his intentions, he drove over to Murray's house and went berserk. In the kitchen, he threw glasses against the wall and the two screamed at each other. In the end, it made no difference. Murray sold the songs and there was nothing Brian could do. In the days following, Brian became deeply depressed and decided to give away his gold records. He figured if he didn't own the songs, he didn't want them. He drove over to session musician Hal Blaine's house and tried to give him the gold records. Hal refused them. He was aware of Brian's situation and reassured him, "You wrote those songs, Brian. That's something nobody can take away from you." Hal told Brian it didn't matter about the songs, he could write more. Brian stated, "No, I did my work. I'm finished." In mid-1969, Brian had opened a health food store named the Radiant Radish. He showed up to work in his pajamas and once refused to sell vitamin tablets without a prescription. It closed down a year after opening. While the Beach Boys were finishing up their next album, Sunflower, Brian met Elton John in the studio. He was just starting out, and Brian played him a master copy of Good Vibrations, then asked Elton to play one of his songs on the piano. Elton responded, "Not after that." When the Beach Boys' next album, Surf's Up, was being made, Brian was unhappy the group were using his previous work from Smile. He had wrote a new song for the album called Till I Die. Mike Allen Carl found it too depressing. Brian recorded the song anyway, and it was added to the album. The album was a commercial success, and Brian played it for days. By 1972, the Beach Boys had quit wearing matching outfits on stage. Bruce Johnston had left the band, and Brian was so out of it, the whole year was a blur. At this time, the Beach Boys decided to head to Holland to record their next album, and it took Brian 3 attempts before he actually boarded the plane and joined them. While there, he soon lost interest in recording and spent most of his time smoking pot and drinking apple cider in his residence. At one time, he got so drunk he drove his car into a tree. One of Brian's songs, Sail On Sailor, was used for the album. He'd wrote it a year previous, but refused to have anything to do with the recording. The only reason the song had been used was their record company hated the album and demanded a single. By 1973, Murray's health began to deteriorate. He contacted Dennis and told him he didn't have long left to live. He suffered a heart attack in April and barely left his bed after that. Despite this, he contacted Brian and asked him to work on a song he'd wrote. It was called La Zalu. Murray told Brian this would be the last song he wrote with his death approaching. He stated, "I'm dying, Brian. I'm old, I'm dying, and I'm scared." Brian headed over to his house to listen to the song. Murray sat on the couch weak and tired while Brian circled the room manically. Murray had also made amends with Dennis at this point, and 2 weeks later he suffered a final heart attack and died. On the day Murray died, he'd felt fine. Strong enough, he felt, to venture out. Audrey was visiting and they planned a shopping trip. By the time she got there, he was on the floor and he died in her arms. Brian never attended the funeral, and remembering back to when Murray told him "you'll never be a man," he told an interviewer at the time that Murray's death was making a man of him. Following the death of his father, little interest in his band, and his ever-growing drug habit, Brian took to his bed where he stayed more or less for the next 2 years. From 1973 to 1975 goes as follows. Brian's daily routine: wake up, eat a breakfast of eggs on toast, watch Mr. Rogers on TV, eat lunch, normally from 3 to 6 hamburgers, play piano throughout the day, the same songs over and over, and in the evening eat steaks, cookies and candy. At this point, a dealer drops off a regular supply of drugs to his mailbox and Brian begins using heroin. Meanwhile, during this period, the Beach Boys released a compilation album called Endless Summer. It did incredible numbers and the group focused on touring their hits. As the months go by, Brian deteriorates. as his daughters grow older, they begin to question his mental state. Marilyn tells them, "Your dad has a drug problem. He's not like other dads. He's not normal. He's a genius." Months go by in the same routine. Brian begins to gain a substantial amount of weight. He weighs over 250 pounds when he checks the scales. He decides not to step on them again. Brian begins to break down. His auditory hallucinations are unbearable. He wanders the halls of his house at night looking for a safe room to sleep in. The Beach Boys' lawyers contact Brian, and he is told if he doesn't begin writing music again, the record label will sue him and he will lose his house. The threats do nothing to persuade Brian into a healthy lifestyle. At this point, he's in such a bad state, he isn't even washing himself. By the end of 1975, Marilyn had no idea what to do with Brian. In desperation, she called Dr. Eugene Landy. Dr. Landy had a reputation for treating celebrities and lost causes. He prided himself on treating Richard Harris, who struggled with alcoholism his whole life. Side note, Richard Harris began drinking again after Landy's successful treatment. Dr. Landy was ridiculously expensive and gleefully admitted that. Marilyn booked an appointment and informed Landy of Brian's problems. He suggested 24-hour therapy for at least 2 years and told Marilyn it sounded like he was a paranoid schizophrenic. A team was assembled to treat Brian, which would include a psychiatrist, a nutritionalist and minders. With no other options, Marilyn agreed to the terms. She told Rolling Stone magazine, "When I first met Landy, I knew I'd met someone who could play Brian's game." In the following days, therapy began. Brian was cooked healthy meals, forced to jog every morning, attend therapy and wash every day. Landy's assistant also moved into Brian's house to keep an eye on him. One time, Brian refused to get out of bed and Landy threw a bucket of water over him. His philosophy was, there could only be room for one crazy voice in Brian's head. The techniques, though extreme, began to show results. After this, Landy began pushing Brian to write new material. The Beach Boys hadn't released an album in 3 years, and Brian, now sober and healthy, attended the studio with a new confidence. He told the group he'd produce them an album if they wanted him to, and so began the Beach Boys' next album, 15 Big Ones. During the record, Landy's interference annoyed the Beach Boys. There was even an idea put forward to name the album Group Therapy. This was quickly rejected. 15 Big Ones was the first record Brian had solely produced since Pet Sounds. After work began, it didn't take long for Brian to lose motivation in the studio. The sessions were the fastest Brian had ever done, and it shocked the group seeing him perform at such a low standard. The Beach Boys began to worry he was no longer competent enough to produce a record. Unbeknownst to Brian, the band touched up the recordings after he was finished. Cole stated in disappointment, "This is a record." Side note, despite Landy promoting a healthy lifestyle, he allowed Brian to smoke 1 joint a day as long as he did his work. He also hired an aide to stand over Brian with a baseball bat, creating the image that, if you don't work, I'll hit you with this bat. The album was released and greeted with hostility from fans. The main criticisms being the cover songs and the poor vocal contributions from Brian and Dennis. The production sounded like a cheap imitation of the Beach Boys' sound. Brian acknowledged the hate from fans and promised his next album would be much more ambitious. Expecting the worst, Mike had planned a promotional tour for the album. He wrote a song called Brian's Back, which was used to promote his return to production and live performance. During the promotional tour, Brian was to appear in a sketch on Saturday Night Live. On the day of rehearsals, unaware of Brian's program, actor and comedian John Belushi bought a large amount of alcohol and beers to Brian's house. When Dr. Landy arrived, Brian had eaten a whole pepperoni pizza to himself and drank 5 beers. Landy went berserk at John Belushi. He stated, "You're fat and you want to be fat, but not Brian." The two stood screaming at each other before they were broke apart. The sketch began as planned and Brian was driven to the beach. When he got there, he began to fear he would drown when he entered the water. Landy wrote him a note that he kept in his dressing gown pocket. It read, "I promise you won't drown. You will live. Signed, Dr. Landy." Brian braved the water and hated every second of it. He exited the water swearing and headed off the beach. Meanwhile, the Brian's Back campaign was in full swing, and as a result, the album went gold. It was the best-selling Beach Boys album since 1965. Bruce Johnston later described the campaign as brilliant and bogus. The Beach Boys set off on another tour and Brian made his first ever talk show appearance on the Mike Douglas Show. The show opened with Brian performing a rendition of Sloop John B on piano before being interviewed. Speaking out the side of his mouth, he spoke about the negative effects of drugs while talking in awe of the Maharishi. The appearance ended with Brian performing Back Home on piano. The Beach Boys' next album was ultimately a solo project with the group's name slapped on. Brian wrote almost all of the material and played almost every instrument. Mike Love and Al Jardine were rarely present at the sessions. Instead of an orchestra, Brian relied heavily on synthesizers to create his desired sound. It was the Beach Boys' strangest album to date. The album was met with mixed reviews. Despite this, Brian loved it. He's since said it was his favourite Beach Boys album. Over time, Dr. Landy's salary had increased. It was now $20,000, the equivalent of $100,000 in 2023. Landy had also suggested being paid a percentage of Brian's earnings rather than an hourly rate. When Brian found out how much he was paying Landy, he was so angry he threw a punch at him. Landy was fired, and afterwards, Brian began considering going back on the road with the Beach Boys permanently. He even pulled out his old Fender bass. Though he'd been fired, Brian felt Landy's treatment had been a success. He employed Mike Love's 2 cousins, Stan and Steve, as well as a former model named Rocky, to be his handlers to replace Landy. Brian felt the regimented routine was the key, no matter who enforced it. He stayed sober but began eating too much and spending a lot of time in his room. Brian began meetings with a new therapist, but soon he began to miss sessions. As the months went on, the 3 handlers began to intimidate Brian. They forced him out of bed in the morning and pushed him into the shower, ignoring his pleas that he was frightened of the water. He was bribed with cigarettes to comply or given cigarettes to calm down. Rocky and Stan often yelled at Brian, and due to their size and strength, he couldn't do a thing but accept it. It reminded him of his father Murray. Side note, at this time Mike Love was in Switzerland with the Maharishi learning how to levitate. By July 1977, the Beach Boys began another tour joined by Brian. During one of the shows, Mike got frustrated with Brian and threw a piano bench at him. Tensions amongst the group were now at an all-time high. Mike and Al on one side, Dennis and Carl on the other. They even took separate aeroplanes and attended the stage by separate doors. Dennis at this time released a solo album titled Pacific Ocean Blues. It was met with glowing reviews, which only served to annoy Mike and Al. Mike had now took leadership role in the band and decided their next album be recorded at the Maharishi International University. While there, Mike demanded everyone working on the album meditate or they'd be fired. Brian was forced into the studio where he played melodies before going outside to smoke a joint and leave the others to finish the songs. He spent the rest of his time playing ping pong alone, hitting the ball back and forth against the wall. As for Carl and Dennis, they showed little interest in the music. The album, titled MIU for short, was produced by Al Jardine. It did so poorly it failed to chart in the UK. It peaked at 151 in the US charts before dropping off. Brian has since stated he can't remember making the album. Their next album, which came not long after, wasn't much better. It was titled Merry Christmas from the Beach Boys and was so bad their record company rejected it. As 1978 began, Dennis had started using heroin and Carl was having problems with alcohol and cocaine. At this point, Brian told Marilyn he wanted a divorce. He felt she wasn't giving him the care and attention he needed. Brian moved into a small rented house and Rocky, Stan and Steve continued their round-the-clock supervision. In early 1979, the Beach Boys began work on their next record titled LA Light album. Brian arrived at the sessions, said hello, then fell asleep on the floor. He attempted some production, but thought it was better Bruce Johnston take over. Forced to continue touring, Brian drank every day. One time he went on stage and after only 2 songs lay down and tried to go to sleep. When at home, he and Dennis snorted cocaine and attempted to write music together. One night, Dennis had watched Brian snort 6 grams of cocaine in 1 hour. He passed out and then went into a seizure. Stan and Rocky found out about this and blamed Dennis for supplying Brian. They decided to frighten Dennis into staying away from him. The 2 minders broke into his house and beat him mercilessly. They threw him through a window and left him bleeding on his bed. Dennis pressed charges and the 2 men were fined and given probationary sentences. Brian meanwhile lived in constant fear. He paced his house endlessly and went to the local liquor store and bought cigarettes and alcohol. One day Brian woke up and had the urge to visit his old house where he'd lived with Marilyn. He decided to go using the key he still owned. Brian entered the house and looked around before going upstairs to the bedroom where Marilyn was sleeping. He opened the door and saw Marilyn asleep with one of Brian's minders, Rocky, sleeping next to her. The 2 awoke and Brian rushed out the room. He paced outside before the couple exited the house and offered him a lift home. He refused. When Stan and Rocky appeared at Brian's house later, he was sat in his living room drunk and volatile. The 2 shouted at him like drill sergeants, encouraging him to exercise. He refused. Once they convinced him a workout would get him high, he agreed. Brian decided on swimming, but when he got into his pool, he'd changed his mind. Instead, he just walked around in circles. He did this often when he didn't want to swim. Rocky and Stan watched him for 20 minutes and he went around the pool over 100 times. Eventually, Stan said if he was going to keep doing this, they'd have him committed. Brian told them they were fired and continued walking around the pool. Confused what to do, they stood watching him for another 20 minutes. By now, he'd done over 200 circles. Finally, Stan grabbed Brian and pulled him out. Brian, agitated, snapped, "No, I want to do this." Stan snapped back, "I said you can't." Brian broke away from him, ran over to his house and began kicking out the glass windows. The 2 minders then wrestled Brian into a car and drove him to the nearest hospital. While in the hospital, Brian was taken to see a doctor. The doctor was smoking a pipe and Brian freaked out. It reminded him of his father, Murray. He went mad and began throwing books and paperweights. Stan and Rocky restrained him and the doctor injected him with a sedative. He was then checked into Brotman Psychiatric Hospital and put into a straitjacket. Brian spent 3 months there and in that time became friendly with a nurse called Carolyn Williams. She brought him extra food and talked to him for hours on end. Meanwhile, Stan and Rocky were fired by Marilyn. She'd got word Brian was in a mental hospital and felt his breakdown was due to seeing her and Rocky that day. With the guilt she felt, she immediately fired the two. They asked for their job back several times, but Marilyn refused. After that, they decided to go into Brotman and see if Brian would hire them back. Stan told Brian they loved him and only wanted to help. Brian asked Stan if constantly poking him in the chest was good therapy. He then turned to Rocky and asked if sleeping with his wife was responsible behaviour. Neither one answered. Brian walked away from the two without saying goodbye. After their dismissal, two of Brian's minders, Rocky and Stan, kept turning up at Marilyn's residence attempting to get their job back. Neither one wanted to give up their $50,000 a year salary. That's the equivalent of $240,000 in 2023. They never were rehired, and after they wouldn't stop turning up, Marilyn notified the police and hired professional bodyguards. By March of 1979, Marilyn and Brian had divorced and Brian had been released from Brotman a month previous. Marilyn had told Brian her daughters were embarrassed by him and no longer wished to see him. Dennis Wilson at this point had been thrown out of the Beach Boys. His dependency on alcohol made him too unreliable. The same month, the Beach Boys' next album, titled LA Light Album, was released. After their next tour ended, the group took a vacation to Hawaii where they ate a diet of nothing but soup with vegetables and jogged each day. This did nothing to help Brian's mental state. He was deeply paranoid and isolated himself from everyone except the nurse he'd met at Brotman. Carolyn Williams became both a servant and protector to Brian. The two moved into a 2-bedroom home in Santa Monica Brian had rented after leaving Brotman. The house was stocked with food, booze, and Carolyn supplied Brian with marijuana. Brian slept in the guest room, with Carolyn taking the master bedroom. Carolyn soon became involved with all of Brian's affairs. She attended Beach Boys meetings and accompanied Brian on tour for the next 2 years. The other Beach Boys didn't like her one bit. The group continued recording music, hoping if a miracle happened, their next album would go gold. It didn't. Keeping the Summer Alive was another Beach Boys failure. By this point, the Beach Boys as a band were down to just 2 members, Mike Love and Al Jardine. Brian was too much of a mess to tour. Dennis had similar problems due to his alcoholism, and Carl was working on a solo project. Brian's weight by 1981 had ballooned to 300 pounds. He smoked cigarettes one after the other, while consuming as much alcohol, food, caffeine and drugs as he physically could. When he awoke in the morning, his hands shook so violently he spilled whatever drink he was holding. The Beach Boys regrouped in 1981 and set off on another tour, Brian included. He showed little interest in being on stage and struggled singing lead through the songs. By 1982, Brian's drug use was at its peak. One weekend, he spent $15,000 to $20,000 on cocaine for him and Dennis. When Carl got word of how bad Brian was, he forced him into hospital for a 72-hour involuntary stay. After 3 days of withdrawals, Brian, with Carolyn's help, was released. He got home and watched the news of John Belushi's death on TV. He died of a heroin overdose at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. As Brian watched the news reports, he remembered meeting Phil Spector at the Chateau Marmont, where the two worked on Don't Hurt My Little Sister. That was, at this point, almost 20 years ago. The tours continued with Brian missing many shows. One night the Beach Boys played while Brian sat in his hotel with Carolyn. They ordered boatloads of food and 14 bottles of champagne. Another time in the course of one day, Brian ordered 44 grasshopper cocktails from room service. Other than alcohol, he regularly called down to order half a gallon of coffee to be sent to his room. At this point, Brian's ex-wife Marilyn and Carl decided to get back in contact with Dr. Eugene Landy. Landy was cautious when Carl approached his office asking for help. He stated, "I can't be sure. He's older now. I don't know how bad he is. But I want complete and total control." With little option, Carl agreed. After this, Brian received a letter informing him he was fired from the Beach Boys and he was broke. It was all lies, just a way to get him back into treatment. Brian and Carolyn attended meetings until Brian agreed to enter Cedars Cyanide Hospital for examination. After his stay, he was taken directly to Hawaii and Carolyn was sent a letter informing her to leave his home. It was signed by Brian. In Hawaii, Brian was put on a juice-only fast, ordered to exercise and attend therapy each day. Everywhere he went, a team of aides followed him. When Brian returned to LA, he rented a mansion in Malibu. He was followed closely by Dr. Landy's support team. Brian kept up his routine of exercise, healthy eating, and therapy sessions. By this time in 1983, Dennis had become a chronic alcoholic. He carried vodka mixed with apple or grapefruit juice everywhere he went and would go into withdrawal should his blood alcohol level drop. The week of his death, he attempted rehab but walked out on the second day. Brian received a phone call one night and was told Dennis had drowned. Brian cried all night and through to the next day. By 1984, Brian had lost a considerable amount of weight and looked healthier than he had in decades. Tours continued as normal with Dr. Landy. During this time, the Beach Boys began thinking about their next record. It was not to be produced by Brian. He was seen at this point as incompetent. The Beach Boys' self-titled album was released in 1985. It was just another attempt to mimic their previous success. As expected, it was a failure. Brian and Dr. Landy at this point decided a solo project would fare better. In 1986, Gary Usher, the first person Brian had written songs with, entered the project. He and Brian recorded 6 demos. During this time, Brian met his future wife, Melinda Ledbetter. The two had met when Melinda was working at a car dealership. Brian bought a car on the spot and began telling Melinda about the death of his brother and how he was still grieving. 2 days later, Landy phoned Melinda and asked her if she'd like to go on a date with Brian. She agreed, and Brian picked her up at her apartment. He'd forgotten the door number, so he stood in the courtyard shouting Melinda until she appeared. Melinda later commented, "He was so honest and sincere, but very closely monitored." During their date, 2 minders were in attendance and Landy phoned every hour for updates. They went out on a second date, then began regular phone calls. After that, it became common routine, but they were never alone. Brian's minders kept a close watch. Meanwhile, Brian continued working on songs with Gary Usher. Difficulties began when Landy began to interfere. He insisted his lyrics be added, and every time Landy butted in, Brian lost interest. The project was soon abandoned and the songs scrapped. Side note, one of the songs Usher and Brian wrote, "Let's Go to Heaven in My Car," ended up in the 1987 film Police Academy 4. The album continued without Gary Usher, and while working, Landy phoned constantly to give instructions to Brian. After some of the sessions, Landy would confiscate the master tapes. The recording sessions were such a mess, at one point, one of Landy's aides bribed Brian with a milkshake to change the lyrics of a song. Those working with Brian described the project as chaotic and unbelievably frustrating. Meanwhile, the Beach Boys were asked to write a song for the movie Kokomo.
The movie's called Cocktail.
The song would become their biggest hit since Good Vibrations. In 1988, the Beach Boys recorded the song Kokomo to feature on the soundtrack for the film Cocktail. The song had been written by John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, who was once a neighbour to Brian Wilson. According to the Beach Boys, Landy wanted a producer's credit if Brian was to have any involvement. He wasn't given one, so therefore Brian would not be involved in recording Kokomo. Brian felt the group had excluded him from the project, which was the narrative Landy was running with. After this, the Beach Boys quickly compiled an album to cash in on the success of Kokomo. Still Cruising featured new material and previously recorded hits by the Beach Boys. That same year, Brian released his first self-titled solo album. It was met with glowing reviews. At this time, a lawsuit was filed against Dr. Landy. The charges were prescribing drugs illegally, along with other unethical charges. Landy pleaded not guilty. Landy by this point had made Brian sever ties with his family, friends, and end his relationship with Melinda Ledbetter. Brian's health seemed to have deteriorated by this point. He looked to have suffered the effects of a stroke. When a friend visited Brian at his home, he reported the two were interrupted constantly with aides bringing Brian pills to take. When questioned, they stated the pills were due to Brian's allergies. By 1991, Landy, battling the charges brought against him, agreed to separate himself from Brian for 90 days to prove Brian was independent. Unfortunately, nothing was stated about Landy's aides, who continued to follow Brian's every move. By February 1992, Landy was barred from seeing Brian. The Beach Boys' next album, Summer in Paradise, contained no involvement from Brian and minimal from Carl. This was in fact the first Beach Boys album to feature no new Brian Wilson material. The album was made up of new material written by Mike and Terry Melcher. Melcher would also produce the album. Summer in Paradise failed to even chart in the US or UK, making it by far the Beach Boys' worst album. In 1993, Mike Love sued Brian for songwriting royalties he felt was owed. Bruce Johnston later stated, "It's not a personal thing against Brian. Mike loves Brian." Melinda Ledbetter later stated, "I do believe in his own way, Mike loves his cousin, and I know Brian loves him, even after the lawsuit." Around this time, Brian was reassessed by doctors who found he wasn't paranoid schizophrenic as Landy had diagnosed him.
He was re-diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, his medication was changed, and his mental state improved dramatically. One day out walking in a daze, Brian was almost hit by a car. It turned out the woman driving was Melinda Ledbetter. She and Brian rekindled their relationship and were married by 1995. They chose Melinda's birthday, so their wedding anniversary would be the same. They then moved to a mansion in St. Charles, Illinois, a stark contrast to sunny California. After that, they adopted 2 daughters. At this time, the documentary I Just Wasn't Made for This Times was released, and the Beach Boys began work on their next album. Stars and Stripes Volume 1 was made entirely of previous Beach Boys songs. No new material was recorded. Seeing film footage around the band at the time, in front of the camera at least, they seemed in good spirits. Behind the scenes, Brian was treated like an invalid. The other members would constantly say, "Do this, do that, are you okay?" In late 1996, Carl was diagnosed with lung cancer. Carl, with little chance of surviving, continued touring with the group. He lost his hair and wore a wig on stage. In between songs, he took air from an oxygen tank. He continued on the road until he was too weak and sick. When he stopped touring, Carl was replaced on stage with Dave Marks, who'd been part of the original Beach Boys lineup. Marks had left in 1963 over disputes with Murray. Near the end of 1997, Brian and Melinda went over to Carl's house to watch the Super Bowl. When Brian left, he stated, "I don't think we're ever going to see him again." At that time, Brian's mother passed away. 2 months later, Carl passed away in February of 1998. At the funeral, Brian broke down in tears and was heard saying, "He's gone, and I don't know where he went." Brian was now the last of the Wilsons. That same year, Brian released his second solo album, Imagination. At this time, he decided if he was going to succeed in the music business, he couldn't just put an album out every 10 years. He made a difficult decision and began touring again. Brian gave his first ever solo tour in 1999. From that point, Brian continued touring. His auditory hallucinations were noted as being most severe while performing. In 2012, Brian got together with the last remaining Beach Boys and they recorded their final album, That's Why God Made the Radio. Many of the songs had been written previous, with chord progressions changed. In an interview a year later, Mike Love stated he was disappointed he and Brian were unable to write songs together for the album. He stated, "I talked to Brian about a year before we even started doing any of the recording. He and I talked about doing a project and he was excited about it, but it never came to fruition at all. We were supposed to be allowed to get together to write songs from scratch like we did in the 60s, but that was never to be." After the album was complete, Brian planned a follow-up Beach Boys album. The idea was soon scrapped, and the songs went to Brian's third solo project, No Peer Pressure. The title was partly inspired by the cover art and partly the reassurance he didn't have to go back to the Beach Boys. In 2014, a biopic about Brian's life called Love and Mercy was released. It had been in the works since 1988, but the project kept getting derailed. Other movies had came out since the project lay dormant. The first film about the Beach Boys to hit the big screen was Summer Dreams, the story of the Beach Boys, in 1990. It was based on the book Heroes and Villains by Stephen Gaines, but bared little resemblance. In fact, it bared so little resemblance, one wonders whether the filmmakers even read the book. Writer of the book Gaines later stated, "The producers did a lousy job." Critics panned the film and picked it apart for its historical inaccuracies. In 2000, The Beach Boys' An American Family was released. American Family was a 2-part made-for-TV drama about the group. The year of its release, Brian slated it, stating, "I didn't like it. I thought it was in poor taste, and it stunk. I thought it stunk." He went on to say, "I didn't like the second part. It wasn't really true to the way things were. I'd like to see another movie if it was done right." He also added, "It was best just to ignore it because it wasn't really true to life." He also criticised Frederick Weller's performance of him. Despite Brian's opinion, the series was critically acclaimed, winning many awards, including an Emmy for Outstanding Miniseries. In 2014, Love and Mercy was finally released. Brian went to see the movie on the big screen. He found it difficult to watch, especially the scenes with Dr. Landy yelling. After the film ended, Brian stated, "Living it was so much worse." The Beach Boys to this day are still divided. Brian continues to tour with Al Jardine, Mike with Bruce Johnston. Brian misses his family that have long since departed. He still has fears about performing, and that's something that will never completely go away, just like the voices in his head. But despite this, he pushes forward like he always did.